Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to another installment of the UCLA Behavior, Evolution, and Culture speaker series. My name is Clark Barrett. I'm the director of the Center for Behavior, Evolution, and Culture, and I'm also organizing the series this year. We meet every Monday throughout the academic year, except for holidays. You can find our website at bec.ucla.edu. And if you go to the tab called Get Involved, you can actually join our listserv by entering your email, and then you'll receive announcements for upcoming talks. So just on that vein of what's coming up, next week, if I'm not mistaken, Monday is a holiday, so we won't be having a Beck talk. Our next talk will be on January 25th. And our visitor is going to be Professor Quayshawn Spencer, who's in the Department of Philosophy at the University of Pennsylvania. And his talk will be called A Metaphysical Mapping Problem for Race Theorists and Human Population Geneticists. So that'll be an interesting talk, a philosophical perspective on racial categories in the US legal system. And today, it is my great pleasure to welcome Professor Evelina Fedorenko from MIT. She's a professor at the McGovern Institute for Brain Research and the Department of Brain and Cognitive Sciences at MIT, and a colleague of Rebecca Sachs, who we heard from before the break, and Rebecca's also visiting us today. So, Ev's talk will be called The Human Language System in the Mind and Brain. If you'd like to unmute yourself for a moment, please join me in welcoming Ev Fedorenko.
Nice.
And welcome, Ev. You can go ahead and share your screen now. And
all right.
Perfect.
All right.
Yep, looks good.
You guys see everything? All right.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks so much for having me. It seems like this is a really fun group to present to and get feedback from. So, okay, so just to situate us a little bit in what we're going to be talking about, I sometimes talk about language as sort of a shortcut for telepathy, because we can use sequences of words to get ideas from one head to another. And to do this, we start with some conceptual representation of an idea, and using our linguistic knowledge, which is a set of sounds, a set of words, a set of rules for how sounds combine into words and how words combine into phrases and sentences, we can construct utterances, which are basically phrases and clauses typically. And then once we have prepared an utterance in our heads, we send it down to the motor system to implement the actual movements of the articulators or of our hands if we're using sign language, or writing or typing a message if we're in a literate society. And on your end, you'll be doing decoding. So in this case, it's going to start out with perception. Auditory perception, sorry, or you could also be reading this in a paper, and you're extracting now from perceptual input linguistic utterances and then trying to infer my mental states. And communicative success happens when the mental contents of your mind and mine are roughly similar. We now know that each perceptual and motor component of the language system is supported by a distinct set of mental computations implemented in a particular specialized portions of the brain. And these components are in turn implemented in separate circuits from circuits that support what I sometimes call high-level language processing, which is effectively everything once the input has been abstracted away from into a linguistic utterance during the comprehension side, or once an utterance has been construed from conceptual representations in production. And most of the work that I've done has concerned this process of inferring mental states from utterances, so language comprehension. And that's what I'll focus on today. But before I do that, I also wanted to outline kind of the main general research directions in the lab, so that maybe in the question period, we can also talk about some of the things that I won't talk about today. So the main big questions, kind of the meat and potatoes of what we do, is trying to understand comprehension and production processes. As I mentioned, we mostly have done work on comprehension, but there's an increasingly growing line of work looking at language production as well. And another big direction has to do with how language fit within the kind of social, perceptual, and cognitive machinery more broadly. So language takes place in social contexts, even though the way that's been studied historically has been very kind of devoid of any social component. But nevertheless, evolutionarily, that's the context in which language has emerged, arguably. And intriguingly, in a recent fMRI study of social interaction in macaques, observing socially relevant signals was shown to recruit a set of brain areas shown here in red schematically that eerily resemble the set of brain regions that we use for interpreting linguistic utterances in humans. And I think the similarity potentially points to deep evolutionary links between language and social cognition. And this construal of language is quite different from how language has been construed for many years, where instead of social perception cognition, it's been linked to high-level reasoning. And I'll talk about some work that undermines that latter view of language. Another biggie is dealing with trying to understand how we represent meanings, both linguistic and more abstract conceptual meanings. And there's a lot of really big issues that I think the field still is grappling with. So we don't know the dimensionality of semantic knowledge, what the key dimensions, organizing dimensions of our knowledge of the world might be, to what extent these representations are tied to sensory and motor experiences versus being more abstract, and the most relevantly to language, how these conceptual representations interface with linguistic forms. We also trying to understand how our minds and brains reorganize after the language system has been damaged. So here's an example of an individual who suffered a massive left hemisphere stroke post age 60 or so, and you can see all the atrophied tissue in white. This person is extremely severely impaired in language, so they are diagnosed with what's known as global aphasia. So they basically have no ability to understand hardly any language, and certainly not to produce it. And here's a brain with a similar-ish extent of damage. Basically, the entire temporal lobe is missing. But this individual didn't know that they were missing this big chunk of their brain until they were in their 20s. And this is a case of likely perinatal or prenatal stroke, which is very early damage, and the kind of damage from which our brains seem to recover quite easily. And we're trying to understand different things about early recovery from early damage versus late damage. So in early damage, we're tackling questions like, let's say language can no longer go in the place where it normally would go. Where does it end up? And does it function in the same way as it would if it was it able to get its default cortical estate? And in case of late damage, we're trying to understand why some people recover much better than others. So aside from, say, variability explained by the size of the lesion, and how early you get brain damage, there's a lot of residual variability that's not understood. And we're testing one current hypothesis there whereby very domain general resources in our brains implemented in frontal and parietal circuits that have been tied to kind of general fluid reasoning abilities may be able to help some people recover from more domain specific damage. And finally, we're trying to understand inter-individual differences in linguistic abilities. So we've been long observing differences in how the language system looks across people in terms of how big it is, how lateralized it is, and other properties. And we've been trying to understand whether those differences are functionally meaningful, whether some way of processing language in the brain may make you better or more efficient at language processing. And this is something that's not very well understood, but and there's a lot of challenges in that general line of work. So the only result we have there so far comes from one type of linguistic experts, if you will, hyperpolyglots. So these are individuals who have learned upward of 10 languages. And we found that their language system is smaller than that in the typical kind of monolingual population. So the language regions don't occupy as much cortical state, and they don't respond as strongly when those individuals process their native language compared to monolingual speakers of that same language. And in terms of methods, we use a wide range of approaches. So I started out my career in cognitive neuroscience using fMRI, but we've been increasingly complementing it with methods that allow for greater temporal precision, like MEG, but also intracranial recordings from grids that can be placed directly on patients' brains during surgery or depth electrodes. And in the last just couple of years, we're increasingly starting to use state-of-the-art neural network language models and try to link them to behavior. To behavior and neural representations of language. And I'll talk about some of that work towards the end. So today I want to tell you about three kind of things that we've discovered over the last, I guess, 10 years now. And those are the following. So first I'll show you that brain regions that support language processing are highly specialized for processing linguistic input and are not needed for a lot of complex thought. Then I'll probe a core distinction within language between structure or syntax, so how sentences are structured, and meanings of words. And I'll show you that any region that is sensitive to combinatorial structure is also deeply sensitive to word meanings. And finally, I'll show you that the language architecture seems to be optimized for predictive processing in the service of meaning extraction. And here's a bunch of folks who did most of this work. And I actually especially want to highlight Idan Blanc, who is now at UCLA with you guys and in psychology. And he's been involved in all of these lines of work as a grad student and a postdoc, and now he's faculty at UCLA. All right. So let me introduce this network that I'll be talking about throughout the talk. So when I say the language network, I mean I'm referring to these regions, a set of frontal and temporal left lateralized regions that support language processing beyond low-level auditory or visual perception. You can find these regions very easily by contrasting neural responses to language compared to some perceptually matched controls. So common contrasts include things like reading or listening to sentences versus lists of pseudo words, or listening to speech in your language versus speech in an unfamiliar language, or speech that has been distorted to sound like bad radio reception, so that you can hear that it's speech, but you can't discern any content. And any of these contrasts very robustly activate this network of frontal and parietal regions. As you can see here, so here I'm showing you 4 sample individual brains, and as you can see, there is substantial variability in the precise locations of these areas. And my group has developed robust tools to quickly and reliably find these regions at the individual participant level. I've been arguing that doing that, using this kind of an approach where you find these language regions in individual subjects is quite critical to probing some aspects of linguistic architecture and its relationship to other networks. All right. Oh, and I should say that within individuals, this landscape is highly stable within an individual over time. So that's pretty critical for probing questions of individual differences that I've alluded to, where an individual marker only makes sense to examine if we know that that marker is stable within that person over time. All right. And so then the regions of this network, some of their key properties is that they respond during both comprehension and production, both auditory and visual. They appear to be similar across typologically diverse languages. So we've been developing tools to localize these regions across languages from many language families, because a lot of the work that's been done in cognitive neuroscience of language so far has focused on English, Dutch, German, and a handful of other languages. I mean, a little bit of Chinese, a little bit of Hebrew, but the vast majority of work has focused on English. And I actually think that this focus on English has led to fundamentally misleading foci in the field. Like, for example, there has been huge amounts of work done on word order, on the importance of word order and sequencing. And the majority of world's languages actually have very flexible word orders. And you can move words around, and there's just enough constraints in the words that you use to figure out how they go together into phrases and sentences. And so I think it's hugely important to the extent that we want to discover something about language, that we try to generalize these effects across diverse languages. Plus, we can actually ask languages like, to the extent that different language families use very different strategies for dealing with particular aspects of converting thoughts into language, do we actually see any neural differences in how the system looks? And those kinds of questions haven't been asked before, to the best of my knowledge. And I think there's important things to be discovered there potentially. And finally, this is a highly integrated, functionally integrated system. So you can predict a lot from the properties of one region about any other region in the network. In fact, this property is so strong that you can recover this network robustly from patterns of bold signal fluctuations, as for example, Rod Braga showed in recent work. So this is just in 3 individual participants showing in black outlines. I don't know if you can quite see this, but in black outlines is a system that emerges from a data-driven, task-free, naturalistic resting state data, where participants just lie in the scanner doing nothing for a few minutes. This is actually more than a few minutes. This is across several sessions. And that's the kind of duration you need to recover these individual level robust networks. And in different colors here showing activations for the contrast that my group has been using. So there's a very nice tight correspondence between this intrinsic network, for which you don't need any particular localizer contrast to find it, and the kinds of tests we use to quickly and reliably pull out the same subset of the brain for asking all sorts of questions about it. And at least a subset of this network is long known, of course, to be causally important for language, so that damage in adulthood to these regions leads to language problems. So I would argue that this network is a natural kind in the brain. It's robustly separable from the rest of the brain. It's stable within people over time, strongly functionally integrated, and causally linked to linguistic ability. So now I'll tell you the things that we've learned about the system. Okay. So first, onto the relationship between language and other abilities. So this is the question that drew me to cognitive neuroscience. Just when I was starting grad school, I guess it was 2002, a paper came out from Noam Chomsky, Tecumseh Fitch, and Mark Hauser, making a claim about something that they called the faculty of language in the narrow sense. And the argument was that there are some very abstract syntactic processes and representations that are utilized in language. And that paper indirectly hinted, some related papers later directly argued that some of these representations are abstract, to the point where these same kinds of representations can be used to support other human unique capacities, like, for example, music, arithmetic processing, logical reasoning, and so on and so forth. And I thought that that claim was a really interesting claim. It turned out that it's totally wrong, but that's fine. That's just how things work out sometimes. But that's a question that drew me to cognitive neuroscience, which was providing the best kind of tools to ask these kinds of questions. Okay, so there is, I should also mention that the claims about language sharing machinery with other functions have been around for a long time, and they also have come from somewhat different directions. So the direction I first mentioned, this study by, for example, the theoretical paper by Hauser, Chomsky, and Fitch, was arguing for something about human unique capacities that may be shared between things like language, music, and math. And later work from same subsets of co-authors even speculated that maybe humans evolved a particular brain region, perhaps in and around Broca's area, that suddenly can support these abstract hierarchical structure building computations. But there's also other kind of roots into these claims. So for example, we know that language is evolutionarily pretty late evolving. So maybe when language kind of came about, it took bits and pieces of existing machinery, a little bit of general executive function machinery, a little bit of social reasoning, a little bit of kind of basic visual and auditory perception, and then this kind of distributed shared mechanisms all together support something like our language abilities. So, and at the time when I started looking at this question, you could find for any non-linguistic capacity you can think of, you could probably find a paper that would argue that language overlaps with it. And a lot of these claims had focused on inferior frontal areas, like in and around Broca's area. I put this in scare quotes because I don't think that term is actually a coherent, good unit of analysis. People use it as such, but it's a very heterogeneous patch of cortex, and so it's confusing to talk about it as if it was a single entity. In any case, so the very first thing we did was to find language responsive areas in some people, and then ask whether those same areas that work really hard when you process language, whether they are active when we do arithmetic, when we hold information in working memory, when we listen to music, when we watch others' gestures, and so on and so forth. And here's a profile of a region in the posterior temporal cortex. This is a bold signal, percent signal change response. And then black and gray are responses to sentences and non-words. And this is estimated with data that's not used to define these regions. So it's always done with a cross-runs, cross-validation. And in different colors, we show responses to diverse kinds of different kinds of stimuli and tasks. And 0 here is just looking at a blank screen with no stimuli. And you can see that this region is remarkably selective for language. So it works a hell of a lot when we read sentences or listen to sentences, and it just doesn't really do much when we do a lot of other things. So basically, when we're looking at a blank screen, this region works about as much as when we're doing math, so not very much. So maybe this is just in the posterior temporal cortex, and maybe in the frontal cortex things are much more overlapping. Well, no, that doesn't seem to be right. Even in this frontal region, which is kind of right around this area that people refer to as Broca's area, you find similar kinds of selectivity. And I should say that all of these tasks elicit strong responses elsewhere in the brain, so it's not like they're bad tasks and can't activate the brain, or that people were asleep during those tests or something like that. In recent work, we've also complemented these studies with another interesting domain of programming languages, which some people have argued bear really interesting parallels to natural languages. Programming languages don't seem to engage the system either. Yeah, and so the bottom line from the brain imaging work is that these regions don't seem to be active when we process anything other than language effectively. I should mention that functional specialization does not equal innateness. So sometimes people want to infer from this kind of evidence that the system is innate. This just doesn't follow at all. Those are different dimensions. And we know that functional selectivity can emerge as a function of experience. So the best example of that perhaps is the visual word form area, a part of the visual cortex that is highly attuned to letters in the script that you use. There is nice monkey work showing that you can develop specialization for new functions with experience as well. And the fact that linguistic stimuli are effectively kind of perhaps the most salient stimuli from the time we're born, or even maybe in utero, because some speech signals go through, makes sense that we would eventually maybe develop a system to store a bunch of form meaning mappings, which is what I think the bulk of language is about. Anyway, but I'm not making claims about innateness or not, because we all have different battles we fight, and that one is one I chose not to fight so far. Anyway, so the brain imaging work is very nicely complemented by an older approach in cognitive neuroscience, which is looking at patients with brain damage. And this is the patient whose brain I showed you before. And most telling in this work are cases of global aphasia, and my colleague Rosemary Varley at UCL has been studying these individuals for quite some time now. And this is a very interesting population that has been ignored by a lot of language researchers for very long, because the reasoning was that, well, their language system is effectively gone. So what can you learn about language if you don't have any language left? And of course, that's not wrong, but these patients are actually the perfect population to ask questions like, what kind of thought is possible without language? And so over the years, Rosemary and her colleagues have looked at all sorts of capacities in these individuals, and they uniformly find that anything that doesn't, that is using non-linguistic stimuli, any complex aspect of thought that can be that does not use verbal representations, is not, for those capacities, language is not needed. So as long as you can get the instructions across, for which you of course need to be a good experimentalist. Some of these are easier than others, right? For math, you can just give people a bunch of problems and ask them to solve them, and they can do that just fine. For some other tasks, it's a little bit trickier to explain to them what you want from them, given that their comprehension is so impaired, but it's doable. And you just find time and again that any complex thought that has been argued to require language actually doesn't. Again, this kind of evidence here is very important. What it doesn't tell us is whether some of these capacities may require language to develop into their adult-like form, because this is now an adult, mature system that we take and we basically get the language system out, right? This is what these big strokes do. They basically wipe out the whole linguistic capacity. And we ask, what can you still do without the ability to convert thoughts into verbal representations? And it seems like the answer is pretty much anything else. But there are claims and some tantalizing data suggesting that language, including from Rebecca's lab, since Rebecca is here, that language is actually quite key to development of some aspects of theory of mind. So it seems like theory of mind as we know it, and neurotypical, well, I guess kids past age 4 or so and adults, does not get to that state if you're missing early linguistic input, as for example is the case in deaf kids born to hearing parents, where the parents just don't speak ASL because they've never had to deal with deaf individuals. And then it sometimes takes them a while to learn, or it takes a while to figure out how to get the kid regular access to ASL or some other sign language. And studying these kinds of individuals has revealed that there are delays in some aspects of theory of mind development, which I think is really interesting and important. Okay, so that's that. So language regions that support, brain regions that support language processing seem to be selective for language and not needed for much of complex thought, at least in the mature brain. Once everything, all the machinery is in place, taking away language doesn't seem to remove those other capacities or affect them even in any way. So now into the question of whether distinct subsets of the language system process syntactic structure versus word meanings. So when we process sentences, just a random sentence from a corpus, we obviously have to figure out the meanings of individual words. So we'll look them up in some mental lexicon, is a term that people sometimes use. But then critically, to understand meanings of phrases and sentences, we need to figure out how words go together. And so we're figuring out the role for each word in the sentence and how they connect into these larger chunks of language that convey phrase and clause level meanings. And even without ever having taken syntax class, we have a sense that, for example, picked up the car keys is kind of a reasonable unit, but something like on his sports coat and is not. So we have these very strong judgments about how words go together into these larger chunks. And the question is whether these kinds of processes, like accessing meanings of words, and this combinatorial processing of putting words together into more complex structures and meanings, whether they rely on distinct or the same mechanisms. And this divide has been prominent in language research for many years. There were some very intense debates back in the 80s and 90s in the context of English past tense, form learning and processing. If you look at the literature on the neural processing of language, pretty much all leading proposals continue to postulate this distinction and to argue for at least a subset of the language network that process this combinatorial syntactic kind of computations and don't care at all about word meanings. But that doesn't quite fly with everything else we've learned about language over the last bunch of years, where it seems like these two aspects of language are very strongly integrated. And the way that we've learned from this comes from many different sources. So in linguistic theorizing, very early on, people noted that very abstract representations of words, like in terms of syntactic categories like nouns and verbs, is just not good enough to capture the richness of the grammar that we know. The most kind of textbook example is our knowledge of verbs, where you can take to shiver, to comfort, and to put, which are all verbs. But of course, these verbs have very different rules for how they combine with other words. So to shiver is fine on its own. You can just say I shivered and it's fine. Comfort requires somebody who was comforted. You can't just say I comforted. It just doesn't mean anything, like it's just not a coherent meaning. Similarly with put, you actually need something that's being put in a location. These kinds of observations and theorizing were very strongly backed up by the fact that people are exquisitely sensitive to contingencies between words and the structures, the context, the kind of syntactic context they occur in, as well as very strong interrelationships between our knowledge and use of words and our knowledge and use of grammar. And these relationships hold both early on in development and through our lives. So these linguistic mechanisms that were initially postulated to be separate, some processing combinatorial stuff and some processing word meanings, appear to be tightly integrated based on behavioral evidence and much linguistic theorizing. There's also from kind of a separate line of work from when people started to build parsers. So just taking kind of new texts and trying to assign structures to sentences. So this is a very standard thing that you want to do in a lot of NLP, natural language processing applications. It became immediately clear that without incorporating word-specific constraints on how things combine, the parsers based on kind of syntactic categories like nouns and verbs just don't work. And that was already clear in the 80s. So there's a lot of kind of strands from different fields and areas pointing to a very strong relationship between them. And in line with that integration, I will show you that they are also integrated in the brain in spite of what some have argued. And there's two bits to this. So first, I'll show you that syntactic processing is distributed across the language network as opposed to being focally processed in a particular area. And any region that is sensitive to structure in language seems to be at least as sensitive to meanings of words. Okay, so for the first claim, so there have been a number of proposals about where the core syntax region or regions are. Perhaps the most famous one has placed syntactic processing in the inferior frontal cortex. So this is work by Angela Federici, Peter Haggard, but also many others. But there also have been others who have placed core syntactic computations in posterior temporal cortex, and yet others have argued that it's actually in the anterior temporal lobe. And some have said, well, maybe it's in a couple different places. So this already, like taking the evidence in tandem, already should raise questions about the fact that there would be a focal syntactic processing center, because if people are finding this in different places, well, something is up. So what kind of manipulations have people used to make these claims? So a very standard kind of manipulation is has to do with manipulations of syntactic complexity. So this is comparing sentences where all the key dependencies between words are local, like the reporter that attacked the senator that attacked the reporter, versus something like sentences with object extracted relative clauses, where this clause that the reporter attacked is the head noun senator is needs to be interpreted as the object of attack, and so there's this non-local dependency that needs to be made. And so this is just a screenshot from one of Angela Ferrici's paper, where there is this focal bit of activity that she reports. But just because some brain region does not emerge in a traditional group analysis where brains are averaged together and voxel-wise functional correspondence is assumed, which is what people very typically do, right? You take 10 brains, you align them into some template brain, and then in each voxel, which is a 3-dimensional pixel, each little bit of the brain, you assume that all people have the same functional bit in that location. And that approach is has a lot of issues, but one of them is that oftentimes a region will be missed because there's just insufficient overlap across people. So in any given individual brain, you can see a robust response in a particular area, but because they slightly vary in where they are in the brain, you just don't have enough voxels that will overlap across people, and so you'll totally miss it. And so one of perhaps the most well-characterized brain regions in the study of the human brain, the fusiform face area, in many group analysis, you just don't see it at all. And yet it's something that's been characterized exquisitely carefully and rigorously over many years in both monkeys and humans. Anyway, so the approach, as I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, the approach that's an alternative to this is identifying language responsive areas in each individual person and then probing the responses of regions thus identified to some critical manipulation of interest, like do these regions care about syntactic complexity? And actually, these kinds of, I should say, these kinds of manipulations that have been commonly used, they can't even be used to argue that this region is specific for syntactic processing relative to the processing of word meanings, because the processing of word meanings is not even probed here. So the standard reasoning is that, well, look, all the words are the same, so whatever you see probably has to do with the whatever difference you see probably has to do with the syntactic structure, and that's fine. But it doesn't tell you whether or not this region is sensitive to, for example, knowing that cat and table are words, but blorp and blicket are not, right? It just doesn't test that. So a few paradigms have been specifically developed to probe both. Oh, sorry, I'm skipping ahead a little bit. But anyway, so that's what I said is all fine. But when you define language responsive regions in individual subjects, and then you ask, do these regions care about these kinds of manipulations of complexity that I just showed you, we very robustly replicate responses in the inferior frontal cortex. So this is now sentences, non-words. So these are our localizer contrasts, localizer conditions. And in dark and lighter grays, syntactically harder and syntactically easier conditions. So you find this robust effects in the inferior frontal cortex, but you also find them in the posterior temporal cortex, and you find them in every other region where you look. So that's to say that it seems like there is this distributed processing, distributed sensitivity to syntactic structure across this network. And oftentimes when I talk about those results, people say, well, isn't it true that different kinds of individuals with aphasia show different profiles? And yes, it is true. But with respect to syntactic comprehension, again, if you look at the literature in tandem, it's very consistent that different kinds of damage to different parts of the language system lead to very similar syntactic processing deficits. And in fact, if you take healthy people and place them under cognitive duress, which is studies that Elizabeth Bates has done back in the, I guess, late 90s maybe or so, you find the very same patterns of syntactic comprehension deficits as you find in aphasia, as you find in kids in some cases. So it seems like when the language system is stressed, in some way, which could be as a function of damage to a particular part of it, well, actually to any part of it, just having less language resources, or you're just cognitively stressed in general, you produce very similar kinds of problems, like difficulty in processing these kinds of sentences with non-local dependencies. Okay, so now on to these methods that I mentioned, where we try to develop paradigms that target both structure processing, combinatorial processing, and the processing of individual word meanings. And a very common way to do this, this paradigm has been in the field for many years, is trying to just degrade the signal in terms of the information that's present there. So you can take a stimulus like a sentence, which contains both meanings of individual words, and the words combine into a coherent sentence level representation. You can take a list of words which doesn't go together in any way, so you can interpret individual word meanings, but you can't get something like phrases or clauses out of this. Or you can take a sentence and turn it into a Jabberwocky, what's called a Jabberwocky sentence, due to Lewis Carroll's poem Jabberwocky, where you basically take all the familiar words like nouns, verbs, and adjectives and replace those by non-words. So it then sounds kind of like a sentence. You know that somebody is saying something in English here, but you just don't know any of the words. So like if you go to a talk where people use a lot of jargon, that's kind of what it sounds like. I hope it hasn't been your experience today. And then the scrambled version of that is basically a list of non-words, right? Where individual words are not interpretable and they don't cohere in any kind of structured way. Right. And so when I started looking at this question, I was, in fact, at the time when I was working on developing a localizer for language, I was fully expecting to find that some subsets of this language network will be very sensitive to word meanings, so respond strongly whenever meanings of words can be inferred, so real words versus non-words, and other parts will show strong sensitivity to structure. So whenever there is structure, even when the content is not interpretable, so like when you process when a plat spouse into a flimmer, the whatever amygdala plat will disembowel, right? So it sounds like a sentence and there's clear structure that you can figure out who is doing what to whom, and lower responses to unconnected lists of words or non-words. And these profiles just don't exist anywhere in the language system. So this one, a little bit, you can find biases towards word meanings, but pretty much anywhere you look within the language cortex, you find this very clear pattern of two main effects. So the response is strongest when both kinds of information are present. It's weaker when it's either unconnected words or Jabberwocky-like sentences, and lowest for non-words. And this is just data from two different experiments with very different materials and different participants. And sometimes you'll see that the two middle conditions vary a little bit in which one is higher, but statistically you just always see two main effects very, very robustly. And for a while, I got worried that maybe it's all an artifact of fMRI, where even though we're looking at these individually defined regions, we're still sometimes averaging over quite large numbers of voxels in each region. So I spent first I spent like 2 years trying to see if we can find individual voxels in individual participants that would show this kind of syntactic selectivity. That didn't pan out. And then we turned to electrocorticography, where we have much higher spatial resolution as well as temporal resolution. But for the purposes of this, the spatial resolution is what mattered to me. I wanted to see if maybe we'll find some electrodes that show this kind of selective responses to structured stimuli over unstructured stimuli. And you find the very same pattern. I mean, so actually in intracranial recordings, we find responses to lists of words substantially stronger than Jabberwocky responses. And that's because there's a lot of electrodes that have that pattern. So this is averaging across electrodes, but there's not a single electrode that shows a pattern whereby the response is strong to sentences and Jabberwocky sentences and weak to unstructured stimuli. That pattern just doesn't exist. So it seems like anything that cares about combinatorics, putting things together, is also sensitive to whether you're processing words that you know versus something that you cannot map onto an existing conceptual structure, your world knowledge. All right, and this is just one paradigm. I'm going to skip over the next bit, but I should just say that in addition to this paradigm, we've now looked at a bunch of others, including cases where you look at violations of sentence structure versus how well a word fits meaning-wise, adaptation or recovery from adaptation when the structure is repeated versus the words are repeated, and a few other paradigms. And pretty much anywhere you look, you find that these regions, each of these regions is sensitive to both of these kinds of manipulations. Notice that sometimes people say, well, isn't it a null effect? No, it's not a null effect, it's two positive effects. So in each region, you find robust sensitivity to a syntactic manipulation and to a lexicosemantic manipulation of word meaning. Excuse me. And, a lot of recent work has also been doing decoding of meanings from neural responses. And what you find, including in our group, and what you find is that there's this very distributed representation of meaning across the cortex, but relevant for this point across the entire language system. And the fact that you can decode word meanings from anywhere in the language system, again, undermines the idea that some subset of the system just cares about abstract syntax and not word meanings. Okay, so that's that. So any region that seems to respond to structure and language is at least as sensitive to individual word meanings. And these results align nicely with the linguistic theorizing, as I mentioned, with behavioral evidence and some evidence from the field of natural language processing that has also suggested strong integration between words and structure building. And yet this runs contrary to many proposals in the current theoretical landscape of cognitive neuroscience of language. We're currently in collaboration with a neurosurgeon. We're doing something that's kind of, I think if that doesn't convince people, then I don't know what will. We're trying to look at single cell responses to syntax versus word meanings. So in rare cases of neurosurgery, in addition to having these macro channels, which record kind of local field potentials, so finer grained than what we record in fMRI, but still from populations of neurons. Sometimes we can have little micro electrodes attached to those, and those can connect to single cell bodies, so we can get single cell responses to different linguistic stimuli. So we're trying that. The places where we can get that kind of data are not optimal for language, but they are in a language responsive area. And so again, given everything I've said, I'm very dubious that such separation would exist, because I think at this point it doesn't make sense conceptually given what we know. But anyway, that's kind of the last frontier of that debate about the relationship between structure and word meanings. Okay, so before moving on to predictive processing, which I want to spend a few minutes on, I wanted to also make the following argument, which bears on the relationship between structure and more general combinatorial processing and word meanings. And that is, I want to propose that the core driver of the language network is the ability to build complex meanings from nearby words. Not necessarily adjacent, but just from words in the quite local context. And relevant to this argument are two sets of empirical findings, which I'll just briefly summarize for you. And maybe we can have a fun discussion about this in the question period. So one is there's this important notion of a temporal integration window that has been gaining a lot of ground in cognitive neuroscience. And the notion refers to basically how far in the preceding input does a stimulus affect the processing of the current input, right? So over which scales does a current voxel or brain region or electrode compute information, integrate information? Uri Hassan at Princeton has been making a lot of interesting claims about the scales of different temporal scales across different cortical areas. And you can investigate this in a few different ways, but we now seem to have some evidence that the temporal integration window of the language network, this high-level comprehension network, is actually really short. So at least relative to my priors, relative to what I would have expected, it seems short. on the one hand, we've already known that this network doesn't care about structure at the discourse level, so that we've known for a while. But that could still potentially be compatible with sensitivity to quite long structure within sentences. But it seems that actually, if you look at, and again, we're doing this in a few different methods with a few different languages to see how general this property is. But it seems like, I'll mention one paradigm just in case some people are familiar with that work and it can help build bridges in your mind. So Pallier and colleagues have reported a study where they did something very clever. They gave people sequences of words of the same length that varied in the internal composition. So they gave them a full 12-word long sentence, like a good, well-formed sentence. They gave them 2 6-word long chunks. So again, you're processing 12-word sequence, but after 6 words, you're kind of switching to a different chunk, or 3 4-word long segments, or 4 3-word long segments, and so long until a set of unconnected words. And they looked at the change in neural response as a function of the length of the longest continuous stimulus. And they talk about it as a kind of log function that keeps increasing for sentences up to 12 words long. If you look at their own data, so this is a PNAS paper from 2011, just look at their figures. And we've now run that kind of a paradigm. So they've done this in French, we run this in English. It's very clear that the response just doesn't increase past 6 words. Like you get to that, so you get an increase from unconnected words to 2-word chunks to 3-word chunks. It keeps going, and then at around 6 it just doesn't increase anymore. We're now trying to generalize this to other languages, and on the one hand, this can seem quite surprising because we know that humans are capable of processing much longer ranging linguistic dependencies than those that span 6 words, right? Like I can say, you know, I met a girl yesterday when I was walking my dog after I came home from work and needed to buy some milk, who was wearing a pretty red dress, right? And this who was wearing a pretty red dress goes back to girl, and there's like, you know, 12 words in between or something like that. We can form these dependencies. So how is it possible that the system cares about a span that's much shorter? Well, I think if we take to heart the idea that our brains are adapted to our environment and the kinds of problems that they need to solve, it's maybe not so surprising, because actually most linguistic dependencies appear to be quite local, and this is true across a very broad range of languages. So if the system, when it evolved, adapted to the kind of stimuli that we were used to processing, maybe it's not so surprising. There's still a puzzle of what happens when we process things that exceed the span of this language of the system, of the language system. And I think it's, I mean, there's actually a lot of interesting lines of work that feed into this now, but I suspect what happens is that at a chunk of about 6 or 7 words, we just convert linguistic representations into more abstract forms and store them as such. And it's interesting that we can form a linguistic dependency between a word and some potentially more abstract representation that's no longer a sequence of words. And we're investigating that very intently right now, how that could happen. But nevertheless, the empirical fact seems to hold. And then another thing, and that's, I mentioned this at the very beginning of the talk, is it seems like the language network is actually not very sensitive to word order, as long as a complex meaning can be constructed locally. And I'm actually skip over the details and then just tell you what the finding is, but you can give people, well, I'll tell you very briefly. So you can give people normal sentences. Again, these are sentences taken from corpora, and I'm using here a color spectrum just to show that nearby words have more similar colors. It's just for ease of showing the manipulations. And then you can introduce word swaps, right? So here you just take messages and gifts and swap it around, so that by farewell end messages gifts, right? So you introduce a little blip there via a word swap. And you can do this multiple times. So this string contains 3 different swaps, this string contains 7 different swaps. In spite of having 7 local word swaps, you can see that the color spectrum is somewhat preserved. Like you still have words nearby that used to be adjacent in the original stimulus. Or you can take a sentence and scramble things in a way that doesn't preserve this local semantic coherence, if you wish. And what you end up finding is that these kinds of manipulations that preserve local semantic coherence don't lead to a decrease in neural responses to language stimuli. So these kinds of strings, which clearly are not a normal sentence, they elicit as strong a response as a preferred linguistic stimulus. So this is just some data here. So this is from 1 to 7 swaps. This is this most scrambled condition where local coherence is broken, and this is lists of unconnected words. And this was originally a very puzzling result that I saw back in 2012, and I just didn't know what to do with this. I'm like, this doesn't make sense. This can't be. And then we replicated this, I think, 4 times now, and once in a different language. It's a very robust effect. And it's not like there's nothing in the brain that doesn't care about this manipulation. Of course, there is. There has to be, right? Of course, we can detect that these are not typical stimuli, but it seems like the system that cares about this manipulation and does the extra work in the more scrambled conditions is a very domain general system that supports kind of demanding cognitive processing across all sorts of domains, and apparently can do so in language as well. But the language system, so I mean, to me, what these results tell you is that whatever the language system is doing during the processing of veridical linguistic input, like the kind of input we normally get, it can do it's the same kinds of computations in these stimuli, and that points very strongly to the computations having to do with building local meanings, which you can keep doing in these scrambled stimuli. Okay, so now let me just spend just a handful of minutes on the predictive processing point. Oh, sorry, my animation just got out of whack, but anyway, so first I should say that we and a bunch of groups have now reported sensitivity to how surprising, how predictable words are, with stronger responses to more unexpected words. So this is, a lot of this work has been done in artificially constructed paradigm, varying kind of parametrically how predictable a word is. This is from a study from an incoming postdoc, Corey Shane, also with Edan Blanc, where we looked at 2 kinds of surprisal in the processing of naturalistic stories. And we computed surprisal based on n-grams, so just taking 5 grams and saying, given the preceding 4 words, how expected is word number 5. Or we did this at a more abstract syntactic level. And again, throughout the language system, so these are just estimates of these effects. And in gray, you see the rate effect. So this is just a 1 for each time a word occurs in a story. So of course, we know that the language system is sensitive to that. And in red and blue are responses to these syntactic PCFG-based surprise, also just a simple context-free grammar parser, and n-grams. And they each explain independent chunks of variance, together accounting for about 40% of explainable variance. So this is just establishing that, oh yeah, right. Yeah, so this is just establishing that there is sensitivity to surprisal, but there is more. And it's perhaps among the most exciting things going on in the lab right now. So just spent like, I don't know, 3 or 4 minutes just highlighting a key result from this line of work. So in spite of many years of investigating language, it's been really difficult to go beyond descriptive models of what computations a language system supports. So surely showing that the language system doesn't care about music or math rules out, big classes of hypotheses for what the computations are that it supports, but it's still not really getting you to what those computations might be. And part of the reason was that we just haven't had adequate computationally precise accounts of how meaning could be extracted from language. Because no algorithms existed that could do that. And then suddenly, just in the last, couple years, a recent class of artificial neural network models trained on next word prediction or filling in the missing word are achieving incredible performance on even complicated language tests. They can answer questions, they can generate free-form text from prompts. And I'm talking about, the most famous of these models are these transformer models like GPT-2 or BERT, and some of you may have had fun playing with GPT-2. There used to be a web interface for a while where you could do all sorts of cool interactive things. I think that's been taken down, but anyway, and there's now GPT-3, which is even better. So suddenly we have a model that can basically extract meaning from language in a useful way so as to do all sorts of diverse things with it. And the success of these models might be taken to suggest that a system that's optimized for predictive language processing, which is what these models are trained on, may form kind of the most generally useful representations of sentence meaning, because of course, to successfully predict the next word, you have to take into account all sorts of sources of knowledge, right? From patterns of syntactic regularities to how words, specific words go together, to world knowledge that some have argued can be inferred partially from the patterns of linguistic co-occurrences. Anyway, so and in parallel, an interesting revolution has been taken place in the study of the ventral visual stream, where convolutional neural nets, which also are now incredible and can recognize objects from natural images, have started to be related to actual neural data from macaques' visual stream. And a remarkable correspondence is found between the earlier layers of these models and the earlier stages of processing. So it seems to capture both the kind of ordering of the steps that happen, and in general, the fit that's observed is remarkably strong. And so Martin Schrimpf, a postdoc and, a graduate student in Jim DiCarlo's lab, along with a few others, have tried to relate representations from transformers and other kinds of models to neural data from human language processing. And there's a preprint of this on bioRxiv if people want to read more, but I'll just tell you the general approach and just show you a key result that I think is kind of perhaps the most core outcome from this work so far. So the idea was that we took 43 diverse language models, including a large number of transformer architectures, and tested them against 3 human neural data sets. And the models varied from simple embedding models to some recurrent networks to transformers. And the 3 data sets were 2 fMRI and 1 ECOG data set. And the key approach is the following. So you take, you have a bunch of stimuli that you have presented to humans in some experiment. You take 80% of those and you train a regression between model activations for those same stimuli and the brain responses to those stimuli. And then having trained this regression, you see how well it can predict neural responses to the remaining 20% of the stimuli, and then you check that against the actual human neural data. And this is exactly the same kind of pipeline that has been used to assess fits between convolutional neural nets and macaque neural responses to objects. And the key result is, one, it works remarkably well, which I wouldn't have predicted. So the transformer, so this is a normalized ceiling. So this is kind of how much we could possibly hope to explain. And the latest transformers basically hit that ceiling, meaning that they explain neural data almost perfectly. But the key result that I want to highlight is that just like in vision, where models that have been shown to be good at a particular task, like object recognition or object classification, those models are better predictors of the visual neural responses. We find that the models that do best on predicting the next word, so on their language modeling test, the test that they're trained on, do better at predicting human neural data. And it's not the case that any task does that. So we've looked at the performance of these models on other kinds of tasks, including kind of syntactically fancy tasks like grammaticality judgment or sentence meaning similarity judgments. And performance on those tasks, although still variable across models, does not predict the fit to neural data. So this, to me, suggests that optimizing a model for prediction may work for both in silico and in brain tissue to come up with a system that does language really well. So I'm just going to skip over the rest here and we can talk more about, I mean, the kind of where this work is going is like, of course, I don't think that GPT-2 is what we have in our brains. Any model, any single model is going to be likely wrong, but as people often say, some models can be useful. And basically the program that's kind of unfolding here is now trying to take some of these best performing models and then take them apart to try to understand what it is about their architecture, their training regimens, anything else explains how well they fit to human neural data. So this is kind of what we're focusing a lot on right now. And ultimately, of course, given the very first part of the talk where I talked about the separability between language and thought, ultimately we'd want to connect these high-performing language models to models that presumably would use some symbolic or sub-symbolic representations to capture actual reasoning that we do with the representations that we extract from linguistic input. All right, so just to take home messages. So I showed you that the language regions are highly selective for language and not engaged in a wide variety of non-linguistic processes. I showed you some evidence against this idea of a pure syntax processing brain area, including that area being focal, somewhere some little center of this network that just does syntax. Anything that cares about syntax cares about words. And finally, I showed you that some of these latest language models seem to be potentially very useful models of how our brains solve language. They're probably not it quite, but I think looking across models and understanding what makes one model provide a better fit than other models can give us some pretty key insights into how our brains solve language. So I'll stop here, and here's my lab, and thanks for listening.
Thanks. Thank you so much. Super interesting talk filled with lots of interesting, challenging findings. So let's turn to the discussion. I will moderate the discussion, and I'll remind people that under the participants section at the bottom of your Zoom screen, if you open that up, you'll see a raise hand option, which is what we call the blue hand. So I'll keep an eye out for blue hands. Ev, maybe if you want to unshare your screen, we can
Yes.
see more of the group. All right, so let's take a question from Josh Armstrong. Hi, Josh.
Hey, how's it going? Thanks so much for that talk. It was really interesting. I want to ask a little bit about the conception of symbol that you're using, and then if there's time, another question also about the relationship between these brain regions and the kinds of brain regions that might be at work in forming common ground, or so a specific kind of collaborative shared information. But on the first question, I mean, I guess I'm thinking about, you've presented a picture in which language is a kind of computational or compositional semantic engine. But I'm wondering about the relationship between that and, say, the reading of diagrams, in which there is kind of part-whole relationships in diagrams, or in even in things like a comic book that without words in them, there's part-whole relationships and there is a complex encoding of messages. And so I'm wondering if on your picture you take these to be part of the language system, or if you have any work there.
That's a great question. That's a great question. So the easiest thing to answer is about meaning that's non-linguistic. So you can have a narrative that unfolds, as you said, in a comic strip or in a silent movie. Those are the only stimuli that do elicit some responses in the language regions. They're not nearly as strong as the responses to sentences, but critically, for individuals with global aphasia, if you have them do complex semantic tasks on those visual stimuli, they seem to be able to do that just fine, which again suggests that even though the language system may get engaged in the processing of some of these meanings, and in some sense, I guess maybe it's not that surprising, because what I think the language system is effectively a store of form meaning mappings. So if you can get to it from the form perspective or from the meaning perspective, so you can activate these representations. But it seems like they're not essential. And in fact, a very plausible candidate for where that can also happen, where that kind of process can also go on, is in the right homologs of the language regions. Because in general, the right hemisphere homologs of the language regions are as functionally selective for language as they are. Like one possibility was, okay, maybe just the left hemisphere is highly selective, but the right hemisphere language regions will show responses to everything, whatever. They don't care about math, they don't care about music. So all of that is all similar. But if you look at the processing of pictures and meaningful videos, you suddenly get a response on the right that's actually as strong as a response to sentences, or even stronger. So that's a plausible candidate for dealing with those meanings. And in terms of like diagrams and part-whole relationships, I don't really know. I mean, so the closest there is, I guess, this, programming languages, right? Which certainly have some kind of semantics, mostly relational semantics, so they don't necessarily relate to information in the world. And this is a paper that just came out in eLife, I guess, last week by Anya Ivanova, showing that the language system is just doesn't care about programming languages. And I wouldn't have, like, I could have argued either way before we've done that work. So that's like the closest to diagrams.
Yeah, I had in mind things like subway maps. If you think about a subway map where, there's spatial relations that are encoded in the lines in the distance. Yeah.
I would bet no. I mean, again, like these global aphasics, like they drive, they navigate in the world, so they must be able to represent that kind of information without problems. This colleague of mine, Rosemary Varley, often says she puts up these brains with like half of the brain missing effect, and she says, should these people be allowed to drive? And people are like, no. And she's like, no, actually, they're totally fine. They can drive, they can play chess, they can do all sorts of multitude of things. They just can't talk to you, and they can't understand when you talk to them. It's like being in a foreign country suddenly, where well, it's a little different because you can think. There's a lot of debate about actually how verbally these individuals think, or in general, how verbally people think. But anyway, they can do all sorts of complex things, no problem.
Thanks.
Great. Okay, thanks. We've got a few more questions. Let's hear from Mark.
Hey, great talk. My question is similar to Josh's question in the fact that how much is this language, or really just the portraying of the concepts that language is meant to provide? Because as you say, you can get stuff without any language and you still get activation in these areas. It might be bilateral. But I'm always curious, is this actually language, or is this just me taking something about the world and you understanding it? And that's what these networks are at least partly involved in, or large part involved in.
Well, so I mean, just to persevere in this, I think it's like language has to be stored somewhere, right? There is nobody argues that we know words. Like we know words, we know what they mean, we know constructions, which can help us combine things together. So we know a lot about mappings between forms and meanings. So I think there's good reasons to think that what this system does is store these meanings, these mappings. And so when you encounter linguistic forms, you can then reference the system, and it, like the way, for example, Jay McClellan talks about is that what you store is a pointer to a broader semantic landscape that's maybe represented across the entire cortex or something like that. But what the language system does is store pointers to the right locations for you to find the relevant meanings and relevant context. But it's definitely not just meaning, because like I said, we can, take that system away and people can reason about all sorts of complex things. So it can be, and it doesn't seem like it's, you can say, well, maybe it's particular kinds of meanings. And it's like, well, if it's that, we haven't found yet a deficit in these alinguistic individuals post damage in adulthood who can't reason about a particular kind of thing.
So to sort of press you on that, if you have a task that does not require this mapping, so I completely agree there's somewhere in the brain that has to do this mapping, but if you have a task that does not require this mapping, but it's just portraying the concepts, and you are getting these brain areas that are activated on the left hemisphere, what does that mean if the task doesn't use the mapping, but yet we see activation in these areas?
Well, there's some response there. So I mean, well, it's an interesting question, right? So given that we don't need these regions apparent from evidence from aphasia, what does this response reflect? Some have argued that it could be residual activation of the linguistic representation. So I can, at least in simple paradigms, that's almost certainly happening. Like if I show you a picture of a cat, you may well the activation may, through the mapping, may percolate down to the actual verbal representation of cat, and that can elicit some response. And in fact, in simple picture naming paradigms, or just picture processing paradigms, I think the overlap is due to some kind of artifactual reasons like that. We've tried to avoid this by using more complex event-like representations, presenting them super fast. We actually don't think it's very likely that people are activating verbal representations. So that, may be construed as an argument for the fact that some aspects of meaning, like it's not just the form and a pointer, there's actually some meaning that's inherently linked to that form, and that's also stored there, and that's why you can get some responses to just the meaning part of it without even any verbal labels. But I mean, I think there's, don't get me wrong, like I think we still hardly know anything at all, and there's a lot to be figured out there. So if you guys have ideas for how to test some of these alternatives empirically, I'm all ears and would be very happy to brainstorm together.
Great, thanks. I just want to follow up for a second before our next question with just that thread that Mark was talking about. So, it's sort of hard to wrap your head around the idea that if you have these networks where if they care about combinatorics, then they also care about word meaning, and that then you could, how to reconcile that with your finding that all these other domains of thinking don't seem to require the language network. I mean, one thing that comes to mind is the language of thought hypothesis. I mean, that there's a language of thought that's independent of verbal language. I mean, do you take your findings to be in support of that, or at least that that's one possible interpretation, or what's your intuition that you would give us for how these can be decoupled?
Well, I mean, so one very important thing that became clear when you were wording your questions, and maybe you didn't even intend it, I'm not sure, but it's not like combinatorics is just happening for language, right? We know that combinatorics happens for all sorts of domains. Yeah. And it's certainly the case. I mean, perhaps some basic combinatorial computation is what's implemented across the entire cortex, right? And it's just different kinds of representations get stored in different specialized areas, and then that combinatorial operation, I mean, for all we know, be somehow the same. I don't know. It's just not the case that there is either separability within language between the combinatorial part of it and the stored representations, at least spatially. And it's not the case that there is some region, which quite a few people have argued for, that is so content oblivious that it doesn't care if it's combining bits of music into a melody, or a few words into a sentence, or a few bits of an argument into a coherent logical statement. Like, that just doesn't seem to exist. I've looked for that very hard, and so it seems like whatever combinatorics and whatever prediction, and in fact prediction is also been now argued by some to be kind of the canonical computation. So maybe it's all about trying to predict upcoming input, and it's just done using different sets of domain-specific representations in different parts of the cortex, but the basic computations may well be the same across these different areas that we support different domains.
Okay, great. Super interesting. Okay, we got a couple more questions. Let me turn to Kevin for a question.
Hi, Dr. Fedorenko, great talk. I was just wondering, earlier in your talk, you mentioned that all the different regions of the language network seem to have the same properties, and that all of these regions can encode semantic meaning from words. Might it be possible that in the end, all of these different brain regions are sensitive to semantic meaning, but the actual decoding or encoding, whatever you want to call it, of semantic meaning happens first in one region and then spreads to the rest of the regions, and we just can't capture that with fMRI. And I know you've done MEG and ECOG work, so I'm wondering if you have any light to shed on that questions. And another question is, what do you make of the overlap / at least adjacency of parts of the mentalizing or default network and the language network?
Good questions, very good questions. I mean, so the timing, yes, there's bound to be complexity in how linguistic information is processed over time. We certainly see, we and many other groups have certainly see and reported changes in the peak latency of response to words, for example, in processing sentences, as you move from regions that are closest to the input regions, which can be either the speech perceptual regions or the reading regions, towards regions that are further away. So there definitely seems like there's some progression of information. What I don't think there is clear evidence of is that as the information moves through this network, different things happen to it. Because if different regions were supporting different kinds of transformations to the input, then you should be able to detect signatures of those differences in some modality somehow. And I don't think there is clear evidence of such differences. In terms of the proximity to the social network, I find this is maybe something this is like one of the things that I think about when I fall asleep a lot. There's this hypothesis that has emerged from some of our work, but also I think independently in Randy Buckner's group, that maybe developmentally and maybe evolutionarily, we start out with a very general purpose, socially attuned bunch of patches of cortex, which may tile the temporal and frontal areas. So we come in as an infant and we're just like, pay attention to humans to survive, right? Like that's the signal from these areas, and they're just somehow biased to pay attention to social agents. And then as we accumulate experience about different aspects of interacting with conspecifics, that system starts to segregate so that some parts of it become specialized for processing faces, others for processing voices, others for representing mental states. That's the regions that Rebecca's been studying. Some for storing these mappings between linguistic forms and actual semantics, some for processing prosody. I mean, so we know that there's a myriad of these regions that are all potentially processing different aspects of the social signal. And historically, different subparts of the field have been studying these areas. So there's people who study face perception, people who study voices, people who study language, people who study social cognition. And I think there may be a lot of utility in trying to actually consider a lot of these social perceptual abilities in tandem to see if maybe we can discover some organizing principles and see some interesting regularities emerge. So Rebecca's former grad student, Ben Dean, started looking at that. And there are all sorts of challenges in doing so, because many aspects of the social signals are intrinsically linked, at least in kind of relatively natural stimuli. And so it may be tricky to separate things out, but we're brainstorming ways to try to do something like this. So bottom up, try to look at a very diverse range of perceptual and cognitive operations related to interacting with other humans, and see if any kind of organizing principles might emerge to try to understand how those systems may have come about and why some areas may be closer to each other than others. But that's kind of an effort for the next bunch of years. It's not like there's answers yet. But I think there's very interesting puzzles. I mean, there's certainly clear predictions, like this kind of a story predicts that in kids, you should have much more overlap in responses to, say, language and gesture and eye gaze and all these things, which separate very clearly in adults. There is evidence of reduced specialization for things in development, including from Rebecca's lab in other domains, but this would be a nice testable prediction potentially.
That's very cool. Thanks so much. I hope that we do find some organizing principles. And
I do too.
just one follow-up: have people actually tried to do tease apart the different language transformations at the millisecond timescales, rather than just looking at the 2 seconds of the entire trial or whatnot?
Yeah, I mean, The main challenge is that people have tried and people have made some claims, and I'm even on a paper that makes that claim, at least in production. So one general potential claim is that in production, things are much more segregated as opposed to in comprehension, where we already have a lot of context and top-down expectations. And so things may proceed a lot more in parallel, but in production, we ultimately have to serialize the output, and that may place more of a ordering constraint on the computations that precede that stage. At least some people have argued for that. So the main challenge is that in the MEG, you don't know where the signals are coming from. People say it's vastly better than ERPs, and just not really true, at least not for cases where you have this extended brain system. So like if you have a focal region, say, like the FFA, you can use fMRI activations in that participant to constrain the search for where the signal is coming from, but with this kind of an extended system, it's just not possible. Now, ECOG or depth electrodes, intracranial methods are potentially great, but there the problem is that you often have very, very sparse coverage, especially with depth electrodes. You just don't, like, what you want is grids. Grids really are much better for probing this, but many doctors are moving away from grids because they lead to longer hospital stays. It's not actually clear whether they're beneficial for like better for cognition, but doctors sometimes make decisions in strange ways. Anyway, so what you want is grids that cover continual cortex with ideally high density sampling. And using those kinds of approaches, nobody has systematically probed the kinds of computations that like may occur in successive, maybe cascading stages. Like I'm just not aware of evidence that shows that in any clear way.
Gotcha. Thank you. Just curious. I'm trying to do that with mentalizing with ECOG. So as
Wow.
language did stuff, but I'll see if it's out.
Great.
That's interesting.
We're getting close to ending on our time, and I want to get one more question. But before I do that, there's something I'm really curious to ask you, Ev. Can you give us very briefly an intuition, this finding that you mentioned about hyperpolyglots? Real quick, like what's going on? Why do they have a smaller language area?
I mean, I think it's, we interpret it as in terms of greater efficiency. I mean, it's basically you don't need to engage as much, as many, or the same computation as many cycles or something to achieve the same level of comprehension. But it's possible that these people already have very efficient processing from birth or whatever, from early on, and so they are the ones that are more likely to then go and learn languages. There is a project that a crazy colleague of mine is going to carry out this year, where he's going to scan himself every week while he's learning Mandarin Chinese and learning to play piano as a control. And so that's, I think, the first very, very carefully done individual subject longitudinal study where you can see whether acquiring another language on top of an existing one may lead to more efficient processing in your native language. But with causal stuff is just really hard to evaluate, but we think it's probably something like greater efficiency.
It's going to do those at the same time? Isn't that going to create, is that doesn't create
I mean, at least those are like separate systems, right?
Yeah.
So we'll know it's going to be happening in different parts of the brain, but
that's a cool experiment.
Yeah.
Okay, so we are getting real close, but I have one more question here. So Breyer, if you can ask your question quickly, go ahead.
Yeah. Hi. So my question is how you would unite this view of language processing with what we know about the sort of most important dimensions of word meaning in like word recognition and lexical semantics. So, we know that, for example, emotion plays some role in early word recognition. We know, the concreteness effect is a thing, and we know things like, or we have hints that, like whether something is like useful for you is like a basic thing that you tap into during word recognition. How do you have some sense of how this kind of work from lexical semantics could be united with your work?
I mean, I don't know if united is an interesting notion here. I mean, I just think we don't really know. I mean, I think you and Adash should do those studies to figure out, like, we certainly know that linguistic information that has emotional content to it will lead to stronger responses, but those effects are really hard to interpret, right? I mean, it could be just like general alertness, like, you know, could be feedback from kind of general systems that track which information we should be paying attention to currently. So I never quite know what to do with those kinds of results. In terms of concreteness and other things, like I don't know. Yeah, I mean, I don't really have much to say. I mean, I would expect that there's some sensitivity to that kind of variance in the concepts that we represent with words. I know that Anya Lashinskaya had a very nice position paper, maybe even it had like an empirical stuff in it too, but it had a very nice introduction, challenging this whole old distinction between concrete and abstract words, because abstract words come in all flavors and they deal with different domains, right? Like there's all sorts of vocabulary to deal with thinking, you know, social representations. There's a whole lot of vocabulary to deal with understanding, you know, theoretical abstract math. And so talking about just abstract and concrete is just maybe not a very useful distinction, but how exactly different kinds of abstract meanings are represented, I think is a, you know, very worthwhile question. So just let me know when you figure it out.
Yeah, no, I was hoping hoping you would have some sense of where
I'm
to go.
happy to brainstorm with you offline if it's helpful, but yeah, I don't know. I mean, like, so now that the hypothesis that there is some part of the language system that does syntax as opposed to word meanings, I think that distinction is just not the right distinction. I think the main alternative hypothesis is that things are organized by the kinds of meanings that are represented in different parts of that system, perhaps redundantly, but still with some bias. And in fact, you know, people like Alex Huth have been arguing for some version of that, although in a very, very kind of fine, detailed, interdigitated ways. It's not like, okay, this region cares about this. It's more like there's different meanings and they're segregated. I mean, we have a paper that's hopefully going to come out this year where we actually find semantic selectivity at the level of single cells in humans. And so that's, you know, some inferences can be drawn from this, others not so much. And of course, in any such method, we're only sampling from a tiny little thing. So even within like a little area around, we don't know like what the topography of different meaning representations would be there, but it does seem like you can find cells that are selective for particular domains of meaning. So that's
Super interesting. I mean, that was an old idea that was long ridiculed, right?
Like grandmother cell type things.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it was ridiculed maybe like it's not like, and I think I got to make sure that we make it clear in the paper. It's not like we're saying, okay, this is the cell that represents, you know, dealing with food or something, food items. There's going to be a ton of cells like that that deal with food items, maybe in different ways and whatever, and then they somehow together jointly represent our knowledge of food semantics or something like that. It's not like it's just, so there's got to be redundancy in the semantic system, because you wouldn't want to build a brain where meanings are non-redundantly represented, because that would be very non-protective of brain damage. Like you want to look out for potential things that can happen. And yeah, anyway.
Super interesting and so interesting, all of the findings you presented, for just sort of thinking about the functional organization of language and what it is and what distinguishes it from other kinds of thinking.
Yeah.
So great, lots of interesting questions. So we are at the end of our allocated time. So thank you so much, Ev, for a great talk. If everyone would like to join me in thanking Ev for her visit. Thank you so much. And I will see